Section 20 of Astounding Stories 5, May, 1930. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Astounding Stories 5, May, 1930. Section 20. The Atom Smasher by Victor Rousseau. Chapters 10, 11, and 12. Chapter 10. The Fight in the Dark. He dropped down softly to the causeway. Within the city he heard a sound such as he had never heard before, as if some ancient prophecy of doom had been fulfilled, a wailing "Aya! Aya! Aya!" that was caught up from throat to throat and rose upon the wind in a clamor wild and mournful as that of the sea birds around the broken eye. It was the death keening of proud Atlantis, queen of the Atlantic for 50,000 years. She was dying in darkness. For, with the blinding of the eye, all the soft lights within the city had gone out. Dense, utter, impenetrable darkness reigned, and even the gibbous moon floating overhead seemed to give no light. Jim dropped to the causeway and began running in the direction of the city. But, feeling the drag of his wings, he unbuckled the strap and flung them away. He might need them, but his one thought was to get to Lucille if she were still alive, and he felt that each moment lost might mean that he would be too late. Through the blackness he raced forward, hearing that sobbing ululation within the walls. But behind him he heard another sound, and shuddered at it, all his hopes suddenly reversed. For that sound was the shouting of the Drilgoes as they rushed forward to conquest. And now it seemed a monstrous thing that proud Atlantis should be at the mercy of these hordes. He had let loose destruction upon the world, but it was to save Lucille. That was his consolation. Yet he hardly checked the racing thoughts within his mind even for a moment to meditate on what he had done. Those thoughts were all of Lucille. He must get to her before the Drilgoes entered. And he ran faster, panting, gasping, till of a sudden the portals loomed before him, and he saw a crowd of frenzied Atlanteans struggling to pass through, and a file of soldiers struggling to keep them back. He could distinguish nothing more than the confused struggle. He hurled himself into the midst of the crowd and swept it back. He was within the walls now, and struggling to pass through the mob of people that was swarming like homeless bees. He fought them with flailing fists, he clove a pathway through them, until he found himself in a great shadowy space that he recognized as the central assembly of the city. More by instinct than design he hit upon the narrow court that was the elevator. But the court was filled with another mob of struggling people, and in the darkness there was no possibility of discovering the secret of raising it. He blundered about, raging, forcing a path now here, now there. He ran into blind alleys, into small threading streets about the court, which led him back into the central place of assembly. It was like a nightmare, that blind search under the pale three-quarter moon and the black, star-blotched sky. Suddenly Jim found himself wedged by the pressure of the crowd into a sort of recess leading off the elevator court. So strong was the pressure here that he was unable to move an inch. Wedged bolt upright, he could only wait and let the frenzied mob stream past him. And louder, above the sound of wailing, came the roars of the Drilgoes swarming along the causeway. Suddenly something gave behind him, a door, as it seemed, broken off its hinges by the mob pressure. Jim was hurled backward, and fell heavily down a flight of stone stairs, bringing up against a stone balustrade. He got up, unconscious of his bruises, ran to the top of the flight, and saw the dim square of palest twilight where the door had been. But over him he could faintly see the stairs and the balustrade winding away to what seemed immeasurable height. That stairway must lead to the top of the building, and thence there should be some access to the amphitheater. Jim turned toward it. Suddenly a tremendous uproar filled the streets, yells, the clicking grunts of the Drilgoes, the screams of the panic-stricken populace. The invaders had arrived, and they were sweeping all before them. No chance of recognition in that darkness. Lucille! Shouting her name, Jim began to ascend the stairs in leaps of 3 at a time. but long before he reached the top he was ascending one by one, with straining limbs and laboring breath. Red slaughter down below, a very inferno of sound. Above, that shadowy stairway, still extending almost to the heavens. Step after step, flight beyond flight. Jim's lungs were bursting and his heart hammering as if it would break his chest. One flight more. One more. Another. Suddenly he realized that his task was ended. In place of the stairs stood a vast hall, and beyond that another hall, dim in the faint light that filtered through the glass above. Jim thought he remembered where he was. Beyond that next hall there should be the tongue of flooring, crossing the amphitheater and joining the platform of the idols. But he stopped suddenly as he emerged, not upon the tongue, but upon still another stairway. He had gone astray, and out of his bursting lungs a cry of rage and despair went up. For a moment he stood still. What use to proceed further? And then, amazingly, there came what might have been a sign from heaven. Down through a small square opening overhead, no larger than a ventilator, it came, a glimmer of violet flame. And Jim hurled himself like a madman against the stairs, and surmounted them with 2 bounds. There were no more. Instead, Jim found himself looking down into the amphitheater. The thick walls had cut off all sound from his ears, save a confused murmur. But now a hideous uproar assailed them. The whole floor of the amphitheater was a mass of moving shadows, of slayers and slain. The Drilgoes had broken in and trapped the multitudes that had taken refuge there, their fearful stone-tipped spears thrust in and out, to the accompaniment of their savage howls and the screams of the dying. Never has such a shadow play been seen, perhaps, as that below, where death stalked in dense darkness, and the slayer did not even see his victim. Only the thrust of spears, the soft, yielding flesh that they encountered, the scream, the wrench of stone from tissue, and the blended howl of triumph and scream of despair. Yet only for a moment did Jim turn his eyes upon that sight, for he knew where he was now. He had emerged upon the other side of the amphitheater, upon the platform where he had seen the priests and dignitaries gathered when he was led forward to be sacrificed. There, in the rear, were the hideous shadowy gods, looming up out of the darkness, their outstretched arms interlaced. And there upon the platform was the Atom Smasher, a little thread of violet light seeping out of the central tube. Beside it stood a group of figures, impossible to distinguish in the darkness, but of a sudden Lucille's scream rang out above the din below. With 3 leaps Jim was at her side. He saw the girl, Tode, and Parrish, struggling in the grasp of a dozen priests. They were dragging them toward the idols, and Jim understood what that scene portended. In despair at the irruption of the Drilgoes, the priests were seeking to propitiate their gods by sacrificing the 3 strangers whom they held responsible for all their woes. Jim caught Lucille in his arms, shouting her name. She knew him, turned toward him. Then one of the priests, armed with a great stone-headed club, for no metal is permitted within the precincts of the god Crook, struck at him furiously. Jim leaped aside, letting the club descend harmlessly upon the floor. He shot out his right, with all his strength behind it, catching the priest upon the jaw, and the man crumpled. Whirling the club around his head, he fought back the fanatics, all the while shouting to Tode to start the Atom Smasher. In such a moment he only remembered that Tode was a white man and of his own generation. He struck down 3 of the priests, then he was seized around the knees from behind, and fell heavily. The club was wrenched from his hand. In another moment Jim found himself helpless in the grasp of the Atlanteans. As he stopped struggling for a moment, to gather his strength for a supreme effort, he heard a whir overhead, and saw the arms of the stone gods begin their horrible revolution. The priests had started the machinery, and high above the din below rang out the wild chant of the high priest. Jim saw him now, a figure poised upon a platform behind the arms, his own arms raised heavenward. Ah! 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 Jim was being dragged forward, with Lucille beside him, old Parrish following, still making a futile struggle for life, while pitiful screeches issued from his mouth. Jim saw the revolving arms descend within a foot of his head. One more fight. One more. The last. Suddenly, with loud yells, a band of Drilgoes leaped forward from the head of the stairs and rushed upon the struggling priests and victims. And, dark as it was, Jim recognized their leader, Cain. And Cain knew Lucille. As the priests rallied for a desperate resistance, Cain hurled his great body through the air, landing squarely upon the shoulders of the priest nearest the revolving arms, and knocking him flat. Then the arms caught priest and Drilgo, and the steel hooks dug deep into their flesh. A screech of terror, a howl that reverberated through the amphitheater, and nothing remained of either but a heap of macerated flesh. But in that instant Jim had fought free again. He caught Lucille and dragged her back toward the Atom Smasher. Tode had already broken from his captors and was working at it frantically. "Hold on!" screeched old Parrish. "Hold on!" They had a moment's leeway. The Drilgoes had driven the priests back into the hooks. With awful shrieks the fanatics were yielding up their lives, in the place of their selected victims. But more Drilgoes were pouring up the stairs. A moment's leeway, and no more, before the savage band would impale the four upon their stone-pointed spears. There was not the slightest chance that they would be able to make their identity known. "For God's sake, hurry!" Jim yelled in Tode's ear. The wheels were revolving. A stream of violet light leaping out of the central tunnel cast a lurid illumination upon the scene. But it was too late. A score of Drilgoes with leveled spears were rushing on the four. "Hold tight!" screeched Parrish. He thrust his arm into his breast and pulled out a little lever. Jim recognized it and remembered. It was the instrument of universal death, the uranium release of untold forces of cataclysmic depredation. "Take that!" screamed the old man, inserting the lever into the secret groove in the Atom Smasher and jerking it in the direction of the priests. End of Chapter 10. Chapter 11. Tode's Last Gamble. A roar that seemed to rend the heavens followed. Roar upon roar, as the infinite momentum of the disintegrating uranium struck obstacle after obstacle. The Drilgoes vanished. The amphitheater melted away, walls and roof. Overhead were the moon and stars. And proud Atlantis was sinking into the depths of the sea. Not as a ship sinks, but piecemeal, her walls and towers crumbling and toppling, as a child's sandcastle crumbles under the attack of the lapping waves. Down they crashed, carrying their freight of black, clinging human ants, while from the sea's depths a wave, a mile high, rose and battered the fragments to destruction. From the crater of the volcano a huge wave of fire fanned forward, and where fire and water met a cloud of steam rose up. A boiling chaos in which water and earth and fire were blended spread over land and sea. And then suddenly it was ended. Where the last island of the Atlantean continent had been, only the ocean was to be seen, placid beneath the stars. The Atom Smasher was vibrating at tremendous speed. Jim, with one arm round Lucille, faced Tode at the instrument board. Nearby sat Parrish, watching him too. "That took a whole year," said Tode. "That pretty little scene of destruction we've just witnessed. The good old Atom Smasher has been doing some lively stunts, or we'd have been engulfed too. We're not likely to see anything so pretty in history again, unless we go to watch the destruction of Herculaneum and Pompeii by lava from Vesuvius. But that would be quite tame in comparison with this." Tode's jeering tone grated on Jim's ears immeasurably. "I don't think any of us are craving any more experiments, Tode," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "Suppose you take us back to Peconic Bay. We'll dump the Atom Smasher into the pond, and try to forget that we've had anything except a bad nightmare." "Don't trust him, Jim," whispered Lucille. Tode heard. "Thank you," he answered, scowling. "But seriously, Dent, we can't go back with nothing to show for all our trouble. Those fools tried to betray me, and then the eye went out. Perhaps I have you to thank for that performance? However, the sensible thing is to let bygones be bygones. But we must make a little excursion. How about picking up a little treasure from the hoards of Solomon or Genghis Khan? A few pounds of precious stones would make a world of difference in our social status when we reach Long Island." Jim felt a cold fury permeating him. Tode saw his grim look and laughed malignantly. "Well, Dent, I'm ready to be frank with you," he said. "The game's still in my hands. I want Lucille. I'm willing to take you and Parrish back, provided you agree she shall be mine. I'll have to trust you, but I shall have means of evening up if you play crooked." "Why don't you ask my girl herself?" piped old Parrish. "He needn't trouble. He knows the answer," cried Lucille scornfully. "There's your answer," said Jim. "Now, what's the alternative?" "The alternative is that I have already set the dial to eternity, Dent," grinned Tode. "Eternity in the fifth dimension. Didn't know I'd worked that out, did you? A pleasant little surprise. No, don't try to move. My hand is on the lever. I have only to press it, and we're there." Jim stood stock still in horror. Tode's voice rang true. He believed Tode had the power he claimed. "Yes, the fifth dimension, and eternity," said Tode, "where time and space reel into functionlessness. Don't ask me what it's like there. I've never been there. But my impression of it is that it's a fairly good representation of the place popularly known as Hell." "You fool, Dent!" Tode's voice rang out with vicious, snarling emphasis. "I gave you your chance to come in with me. Together we'd have made ourselves masters of Atlantis and brought back her plunder to our 20th century world. You refused because of a girl, Dent, who loved me long before you came upon the scene." "That's a lie, Lucius," answered Lucille steadily. "And you can do your worst. There's one factor you haven't reckoned in your calculations, and that's called God." "The dark blur on the spectral lines," old Parrish muttered. Tode laughed uproariously. "Come, make your choice, Dent," he mocked. "It's merely to press this lever. You'll find yourself well, we won't go into that. I don't know where you'll find yourself. You'll disappear. So shall I. But I'm desperate. I must have Lucille. Choose!" His voice rang out in maniac tones. "Choose, all of you!" "Lucille has answered you," Jim retorted. "And how about you, old man?" called Tode to Parrish. Parrish leaned forward, making a swift movement with his hand. "Go to your own hell, you A blinding light, a frantic oscillation of the Atom Smasher, a sense of death, awful and indescribable, and stark unconsciousness rushed over Jim. His last thought was that Lucille's arms were about him, and that he was holding her. Nothing mattered, therefore, even though they two were plunged into that awful nothingness of the fifth dimension, where neither space nor time recognizably exists. Love could exist there. End of Chapter 11. Chapter 12. Solid Earth. "He's coming around, Lucille. Thank God for it." Jim opened his eyes. For a few moments he looked about him without understanding. Then the outlines of a room etched themselves against the clouded background. And in the foreground Lucille's face. The girl was bending over Jim, one hand soothing his forehead. "Where am I?" Jim muttered. "Back on Earth, Jim. The good old Earth, never again to leave it," answered Lucille, with a catch in her voice. With an effort she composed herself. "You mustn't talk," she said. "But what place is this?" "It's Andy Lumm's house. Now rest, and I'll explain everything later." But the first explanation came from Andy Lumm. "Well, Mr. Dent, my wife and me sure were glad to be on the spot when you and Miss Parrish got bogged on the edge of the Black Pool," he said. "Mean, treacherous place it is. Thar was a cow got mired thar last month, up to her belly. If us hadn't found her, and dragged her out with ropes, she'd have gone clear under. Grandpop Dawes says thar's underground springs round the edge, and that it runs straight down to hell, though that seems sorter far-fetched to me. Yes, sir, and if I hadn't heard WNYC giving Miss Parrish on the list of missing persons, and as having been seen near here, I reckon I'd never have found you. Made me and my wife uneasy, that did. 'Andy,' she says, 'I got an inkling you oughter go to the vanishing place and see if she ain't there.' And there I found you two, mired to the waist, and Mr. Parrish dancing round and fretting, and his clothes burned to cinders. It sure seems strange to me to think Mr. Parrish got away safe after that explosion 5 years ago, and of his wandering around with loss of memory, till you found him and brung him back here to restore it. But there's strange things in the world. Yes, sir, there surely is." In the happiness of being back on Earth once more, Jim was content to let further explanations go. The return of Parrish had been duly chronicled in the newspapers, and had provoked a mild interest, but fortunately the public mind was so occupied at the moment with the trial of a night-club hostess that, after the first rush of newspaper men, the three were left alone. Day after day, in the brilliant autumn weather, Jim and Lucille would roam the tinted woods, recharging themselves with the feel of Earth, until the memory of those dread experiences grew dim. "Well, Jim, I reckon I'd better tell you and get it over," said old Parrish one morning. Parrish, quite his old jaunty self again. "Tode had got the dials pointing to the fifth dimension. Eternity, he called it, though actually I believe it's nothing more than annihilation, a grand smash. Well, he pressed that lever, but something had gone wrong. You remember how poor Cain seemed to take great interest in the Atom Smasher. There's no way of telling what had been going on in that brain of his, but it looks to me like he'd known that that lever meant death. It was sealed up in wax, and Tode had got it free on the way out of Atlantis. Well, this is what I made out from examining the thing afterward. Cain had been monkeying with the lever. He'd pried loose one of the wires that hooked to the transformer, and short-circuited it, not knowing, of course, just what he was doing. The result was that when Tode pressed that lever, instead of blowing the whole contraption to pieces, he got a couple of billion volts of electricity through his body, combined with a larger amperage than has ever been imagined. It burned him to a few grease spots. He simply vanished. You don't remember what you did at the moment, boy?" "I don't seem to remember anything," said Jim. "Well, your response was an automatic one. You jumped him. Luckily you were too late, for Tode vanished like that." Old Parrish snapped his fingers. "But you must have got into the field of magnetic force. Anyway, you were almost electrocuted. Lucille and I thought you were dead for hours. We laid you down and set a course for home. I used those dial numberings Tode had given me. He'd said they wouldn't work, but he'd lied. They did work. They brought us back to the vanishing place. We carried you out, and then I saw your eyelid twitch. We worked over you with artificial respiration till it looked as if there was a chance for you. Then I shut off the power and let the waters rush in over the Atom Smasher, and swam ashore. And there it lies at the bottom of the pool, and may it lie there till the Judgment Day." "Tode was a genius," said Jim, "but he never understood that character counts for more than genius." "Let's think no more about him," said Lucille. She had come up to them, and the two looked at each other, and smiled. Love is self-centered. Other things it forgets very quickly. "Tomorrow we go back to New York," said Jim. "You think you'll be able to face the world and take up life again?" "I think so, Jim," said Lucille. "You're not remembering him after all?" "No, Jim. I was thinking of poor Cain. He died for me." "But that was 12,000 years ago, my dear, and today's today," said Jim. "And tomorrow a new life begins for you and me." He drew her closer to him. No, he would never quite forget, but that was 12,000 years ago, and tomorrow was his wedding day. End of chapter 12. End of The Atom Smasher by Victor Rousseau.
Section 21 of Astounding Stories 05, May 1930. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Astonishing Stories 05, May 1930. The Reader's Corner, a meeting place for readers of Astounding Stories. An Astounding Career. Dear Editor, a friend introduced me to your new magazine, and it's wonderful. The best story in the magazine, or rather the one I liked best, outside of the serial, which I didn't read, is The Cave of Horror by Captain S.P. Meeks. Next comes Ray Cummings' story of the Fourth Dimension and Phantoms of Reality. Other good ones are Tanks, Invisible Death, and Compensation. I did not like The Stolen Mind. It seemed to me to be a mixture of superstition and magic, a fairy tale. I'm glad you're publishing this magazine. and I think it is worth double its present price. You have my good wishes to the magazine for a long and astounding career. My way of reading a serial is to save copies and to read the story at one time. I do not like to wait a month for a story to end or continue. Your next issue seems to sound quite interesting. The Spawn of the Stars, a very interesting and I'm sure a fit name for the story. Creatures of the Light is a very vague name. You don't know what to expect. The others will prove to be as interesting as any that I've named. I prefer interplanetary stories the most, as any amount of science can be injected in them. Nathan Greenfield, 318 East 78th Street, New York, New York. Prefers long stories. Dear Editor, I got your first issue of Astonishing Stories, and although I like the stories, I do not like the way you have it bound. This is supposed to be criticism, so don't take it to heart. The pages are uneven and hard to turn, but the stories in the first copy were good, and you'll have a swell magazine if you have stories by Harl Vincent and Ray Cummings. The aforesaid men are two of the best in the science fiction field. Another thing, don't have any short stories. If you have about 3 or 4 long stories, I'd like it better. I hope your magazine enjoys much success. Linus Hogan Miller, 502 North Washington Street, Farmington, Missouri. Another who likes interplanetary stories. Dear Editor, I have read the first issue of Astounding Stories with much pleasure. And if the first issue is any indication of what is to follow, I will continue to be a reader. You inquire as to the kind of stories that your readers think should be published. I think you'll find the most popular brand to be interplanetary stories, and stories along the line of the Beetle Horde. Best wishes for success in your new endeavor. F. C. Cowherd, Room 333, L&N Railroad, Louisville, Kentucky. Attention Joiners. Dear Editor, I have just finished one of the stories in your magazine and could not resist the temptation to write and tell you how much I enjoyed it. The stories are great and are just the thing to give one rest and recreation. At the same time, they fire imagination and are not trashy love stories. The main purpose of the letter is to revive an old idea and see if I can put it through. I propose to organize a correspondence society for readers interested in science. We would use Astounding Stories as our official medium. Each member would receive a list of members' names and addresses, a quantity of official stationery for intercorrespondence, and a certificate of membership suitable for framing. The object would be the discussion of scientific topics and the latest advances. I would suggest an annual fee of $250 to cover the cost of printing stationery, certificates, application forms, copy of the Constitution, lists of members, and official pins. All those interested in the formation of such a society are earnestly requested to write me, giving suggestions as to a suitable name, etc. They will receive full information and a sample of the certificate of membership and an application form. I trust you will publish this letter at your earliest convenience. M. R. Berkovich, B.S.C. 4643 St. Urbain Street, Montreal, Canada. Sound criticism. Dear Editor, you ask for readers to write you regarding types of stories desired. Well, I am an electrical engineer, and of course like my yarns to have a touch of science in them. Also, I like my authors to make an original contribution to whatever theory of science they develop fictionally. This Ray Cummings doesn't do it in his very interesting story, Phantoms of Reality. His beginning is palpably borrowed from Francis Flagg's story, The Blue Dimension, which appeared in a science fiction magazine in 1927. Flagg developed the theory of vibrations, reverberations, etc., and contributed something new to speculative science. Cummings merely seizes this point and dives into a series of improbable adventures. Now, I am not quarreling with their improbability. I like my stories improbable, but I am asking for something more original than the old rehash of kings and queens, intrigues, and returning princes, etc. Again, Cummings seems to lack enough scientific acumen to make his other world different than this. Even a superficial thinker will readily see that the terrain of the other world would not faithfully follow our own in its salient features. However, forgive me for knocking, the story wasn't so bad, and Cummings doubtless can do better than this, or has. The Beetle Horde, so far, is a gem, and holds the interest. Furthermore, its science is splendid. I'm looking forward to its conclusion. The Cave of Horror is a damn good yarn. Well written, interest sustained, but I didn't care for The Stolen Mind. The truth is, that particular story didn't hang together very well. It left one up in the air, as it were, and far from satisfied me. Too, the science involved, to say the least of it, was not very sound or plausibly put. In reading the story, I felt that the author was one who should be encouraged to write more. Nothing wrong with his imagination or ability to fling words, but that he should be gently coerced into writing with better continuity and intelligence. Compensation didn't click. Too loose. Not compact enough. Splendid idea, ruined by hasty writing. Another author needing a gentle hint. But Tanks was another surefire hit with me. Held me to the last word. The story sounded real. So for the stories in your first issue, you see, on the whole, I liked all of them. Still, I also like variety. Can't you give us some of the Francis Flagg type of fiction? H. Hyatt Verrill is another of my favorites. Also Dr. Keller and Clara Harris. I have read mighty good tales by those authors. I believe you could do worse than to run an occasional H. G. Wells story. And if you gave us The First Men in the Moon serially, I, for one, would be delighted. I have tried in vain to get that story, and never have. Well, I guess I have said enough. Best wishes for the new year. May Astounding Stories grow and prosper. And its editor, C. Harry Jaeger, 2900 Jeeden Road, Oakland, California. Likes interplanetary stories. Dear Editor, having read the first issue of Astounding Stories, I am about to pronounce a sentence on it. It is guilty of being astounding to the nth degree. I enjoyed all the stories immensely and will be anxiously awaiting the next issue. Now as for some suggestions which I think would improve the magazine. 1. Try to have an interplanetary story in each issue. 2. Publish a number of interesting letters concerning Astounding Stories in each issue. 3. Have several illustrations in long stories. I think this would improve the magazine, although it is perfect just the way it is. Hoping Astounding Stories has a long and successful life. Forrest Ackerman, 530 Staples Avenue, San Francisco, California. Watch the coming issues, Miss Miller. Dear Editor, saw your new magazine at the newsstand and bought it at once. I like the following stories in this issue: The Beetle Horde, Phantoms of Reality, and The Stolen Mind. I did not care much for the others, and least of all for Tanks. I believe that readers like myself who are interested in scientific fantasies prefer stories of interplanetary travels and fourth-dimensional stories and variations of these themes, such as various space ships and vibration machines for visiting other planets and traveling backwards and forwards in time. Stories of lost continents and of strange races of people living in unknown places on our own Earth are interesting also. A magazine of this kind has unlimited possibilities for stories of the aforementioned types, and I believe that readers who buy magazines of these subjects expect to find therein really astounding stories. Best wishes for the success of your magazine. Ruth Miller, St. Regis Hotel, Cleveland, Ohio. The Scienceers. Dear Editor, this is to inform you that we have formed a club which we named the Scienceers. The object of this club is to bring together members who are interested in science in general, and also to talk the stories of your magazine over. We have no means of reaching those who are interested except through your magazine. We hope you will grant us space to print this letter in your magazine. We would appreciate it if every reader of your magazine living in New York City or nearby towns would drop us a card with his name and address. We then would be able to send him information of our club. We hope you will print this letter, as we are all readers of your magazine. Louis Wexler, 1933 Woodbine Street, Brooklyn, New York. We examine all science very carefully. Dear Editor, in the first edition of your periodical you invite criticism from its readers. I am extremely pleased to note that Ray Cummings is among its contributors. His short, crisp sentences and word pictures are most interesting. As to the type of stories, I would not be particular, but there is one thing which must be observed. Since this magazine is about science, every story must be examined to discover any false statements by the author concerning present-day science. I think that discoveries and inventions to be made in the future by the author, of course, cannot be censored. James Brodent, New York, New York. Young Mr. Wright writes in. Dear Editor, I am accepting your offer to write and tell you what kind of stories I like. So I did. I prefer stories of the fourth dimension. I hope to find plenty of these fascinating stories in your coming issues. Billy Wright, age 11, Shepherd Place, Nashville, Tennessee. Likes his science fiction. Dear Editor, allow me to congratulate you on your fine magazine, it being one of the 7 more or less magazines in print that are the best on the market. I'm glad to say that I can't throw you any brickbats, only bouquets, and thought I would tell you the kind of stories I would like to see in our magazine, if I may take the liberty of calling it that. I like stories of the type A. Merritt and Edgar Rice Burroughs write, particularly A. Merritt, and if you could reprint Through the Dragon Glass by A. Merritt, I wish you would, and give it a cover illustration, as I have everything by him except that one. Please give it a cover illustration as well as any by Merritt and Burroughs you ever print. You certainly have a good title, and in my opinion the magazine need not be changed one iota, except perhaps you might have the background a different color every month. That is, the background of the cover using every color in the solar spectrum, which might make it sell better, and at any rate would make a nice-looking magazine in my opinion. Everything in science fiction that comes out I have to get, and pretty soon I will have so much that I will probably have to pay storage space for it. I have a pretty good amount now, 4 stacks 2 feet high each, but I can't resist it, and will keep on buying as long as there's anything in that line to buy, and as long as I can. Put this in the proverbial wastebasket if you don't want to print it, as that is probably its ultimate destination anyway, as my ideas are not worth much or less than that. But I do wish you would read it through and act on my suggestions soon. Thanks, from an ardent devourer of science fiction, who reads everything in that line he can get his hands on, your and our magazine being one of the best in that line. Worth K. Bryant, 406 North 3rd Street, Yakima, Washington. A great magazine. Dear Editor, I have just come across a copy of your new magazine, Astounding Stories, and to say that it is a great magazine is putting it mild. I enjoy stories of the distant future. The first installment of The Beetle Horde by Victor Rousseau was great. I hope to hear more of this author in coming issues. I would like to see stories by such authors as Edgar Rice Burroughs, Harl Vincent, Otis Adelbert Klein, Garrett Smith, also Ray Cummings. I wish Astounding Stories a long life. Wilbert Moyer, 533 North 7th Street, Allentown, Pennsylvania. Mr. Anderson's Favorites. Dear Editor, just a word referring to your "What kind of stories do you like?" in Astounding Stories. I like stories with some facts based on true science of today, but let the author's imagination wander a little, because anything might be possible tomorrow. I do not like love stories or much humor in this type of stories. Stories of other worlds or of the fourth dimension always interest me, because there is no limit to the imagination there. Why not have a discussion column and print some of the letters. It would encourage more to write and give you their opinion, and whether good or bad, should help you please the majority. Some will maybe say the cover is too vivid, but that was what attracted my eye when I picked it out from among many others. Most of your stories in the first edition were good. I liked The Beetle Horde and Phantoms of Reality best. Also noticed The Spawn of the Stars next issue, which sounds okay. Hoping you all success in this type of stories. C. E. Anderson, 3504 Colfax Avenue, Minneapolis, Minnesota. A Young Reader's Favorites. Dear Editor, I am writing you per your request in your first issue of Astounding Stories. They are most entertaining. I have read 3 of the stories, and they are excellent. You asked the readers to tell you the kind of stories we like best. I like stories that concern the future of aviation. I like interplanetary stories, also the stories about the fourth dimension. I like Cummings, Rousseau's, Leinster's, Meek's, Vincent's, and Starzl's writing, and your magazine is sure worth 20 cents. You can put more science in your stories. Please hold H. Wesso your artist. He can really draw. I have seen his drawings in other magazines, and you may console yourself with the thought that you have one continuous reader. I feel that your magazine is going to be a success. I am also expressing the thoughts of other readers. I'm only 15 years old, but I like to read good science stories nevertheless. I hope to see you in next month's magazine. Ward Elmore, 2912 Avenue J, Fort Madison, Iowa. A Contented Reader. Dear Editor, congratulations on your new publication, Astounding Stories. I certainly enjoyed reading the January issue. I believe that this magazine is the answer to the prayer of those readers who are desirous of something different, something unique. Another feature is that you're charging only 20 cents a copy for a magazine that is really worth several times that amount. You may count on me as a steady buyer of the Astounding Stories as long as future issues are up to the standard of the January issue. Let me urge you that you give us the magazine on time every month. I do not want to postpone my enjoyment of reading the unique magazine on the first Thursday of each month. Keep up the good work, and remember me as a contented reader of your publication. T. J. Creef, Jr., Post Office Box 734, Phoenix, Arizona. A Lollapalooza. Dear Editor, well, I've got to say something, and I might as well get it over with. Your new magazine, Astounding Stories, is a Lollapalooza. I'm sorry I didn't get the first edition of the new magazine, but I suppose you have some in stock, and I'm sending in my 20 cents in stamps to get one. I might as well tell you how I found out about this new wonder. One dreary night I walked into my newsdealer's store to get a paper. While there I happened to glance upon the bookstand. I saw the word Astounding, and my curiosity aroused, I walked over to the stand and pulled the magazine out. Imagine my surprise and delight when I found out what it was. Well, I bought the book then and there, without even taking a look inside. When I got home, I opened the book, and the first story that caught my eye was Old Crompton's Secret, by Harl Vincent. I knew the story was good before I read it, because I've read quite a few of Mr. Vincent's novels, and they were all excellent. The best stories I like are interplanetary stories. Why not have a reader's talks in Astounding Stories, where each reader gives his point of view on the stories in the magazine? I know everyone would enjoy that, as it gives the readers a chance to comment on stories and also see what the other reader thinks about any story in particular. I wish you success in your new enterprise, and hope my first edition of Astounding Stories arrives soon. Joseph Kankowski, 35 Columbia Street, West Orange, New Jersey. The Reader's Corner. All readers are extended a sincere and cordial invitation to come over in the Reader's Corner and join in our monthly discussion of stories, authors, scientific principles, and possibilities, everything that's of common interest in connection with our Astounding Stories. Although from time to time the editor may make a comment or so, this is a department primarily for readers, and we want you to make full use of it. Likes, dislikes, criticisms, explanations, roses, brickbats, suggestions. Everything's welcome here. So come over in the Reader's Corner and discuss it with all of us. The Editor. End of the Reader's Corner and end of Astounding Stories 05, May 1930, by Various.